In 2007, Nokia owned 40% of the global mobile phone market. They weren't just the biggest phone maker in the world, they were bigger than the next three competitors combined. Their phones were sold in every corner of the planet, from Manhattan penthouses to rural villages in Africa. The Finnish company had built an empire on reliability, durability, and global reach. Their phones could survive being dropped from buildings, and their snake game was played by over 1 billion people. Nokia's market capitalization peaked at over $200 billion, making it the most valuable technology company in Europe. But within 7 years, this empire would crumble entirely, and the catalyst wasn't a competitor's superior hardware or even better marketing. It was a fundamental misunderstanding of how software would reshape the mobile industry forever. When Steve Jobs unveiled the iPhone on January 9, 2007, Nokia executives were watching. What they saw was impressive, certainly, but not particularly threatening. The iPhone was expensive, limited to one carrier, and frankly, it couldn't do many things Nokia phones had been doing for years. Nokia phones had cameras, internet browsing, email, and even third-party applications. Their high-end devices like the N95 were technological marvels packed with features the iPhone couldn't match. Nokia's engineers were confident they could build better hardware than Apple, and they were probably right. What they completely missed was that the future wasn't about hardware at all. It was about software platforms, ecosystems, and creating an environment where thousands of developers could build experiences that no single company, no matter how large, could create alone. Google understood this ecosystem approach from day one. When they announced Android in November 2007, just 10 months after the iPhone launch, they made a decision that would reshape the entire industry. Android would be open source and free. Any manufacturer could take Android, modify it, and put it on their devices without paying Google a licensing fee. This wasn't charity. It was strategy. Google's business model didn't depend on selling software. They made money from advertising and services. The more people who used Android devices, the more people would use Google's services, and the more advertising revenue Google would generate. By 2008, Google had formed the Open Handset Alliance with manufacturers like HTC, Samsung, and Motorola. Notably absent from this alliance was Nokia, who believed their own software platform was superior. Nokia's software platform was called Symbian, and from a technical standpoint, it was actually quite advanced. Symbian had been powering Nokia's smartphones since the early 2000s, and it could multitask, run third-party applications, and handle complex operations years before Android or iOS reached similar capabilities. The problem wasn't that Symbian was bad software. The problem was that it was closed, difficult to develop for, and completely controlled by Nokia. Developing applications for Symbian required specialized knowledge, expensive development tools, and navigating Nokia's bureaucratic approval process. The contrast with Android couldn't have been more stark. Google released free development tools, extensive documentation, and made it easy for any programmer to build and distribute Android applications. By 2009, there were over 2,000 applications available for Android devices, while Symbian struggled to attract developer interest despite being on millions more phones. The mathematics of platform adoption worked decisively in Android's favor. When manufacturers like Samsung, HTC, and LG could get a modern smartphone operating system for free, versus paying licensing fees to Microsoft for Windows Mobile or trying to develop their own software, the choice was obvious. By 2010, Android was running on devices from dozens of manufacturers at every price point imaginable. Samsung released Android phones that competed directly with the iPhone at the premium end, while companies like Huawei and ZTE used Android to create smartphones that sold for under $100 in developing markets. This created a virtuous cycle. More Android devices meant more users, which attracted more developers, which created better applications, which made Android devices more attractive to consumers, which led to even more Android devices being sold. Nokia watched this ecosystem explosion and made a series of catastrophic strategic decisions. In early 2010, Stephen Elop, a former Microsoft executive, became Nokia's CEO. Elop looked at the competitive landscape and concluded that Nokia couldn't compete with Android on its own. He was probably right about that. By 2010, Google was pouring billions of dollars into Android development and had the support of every major manufacturer except Apple and Nokia. But instead of joining the Android ecosystem, Elop made what he later called a burning platform decision. In February 2011, Nokia announced they were abandoning Symbian and forming an exclusive partnership with Microsoft to build phones running Windows Phone. This decision stunned the mobile industry and marked the beginning of Nokia's rapid collapse. The Windows Phone partnership was a strategic disaster from every angle. Microsoft's mobile operating system had less than 3% market share and struggled with many of the same ecosystem problems that had plagued Symbian. Windows Phone had few applications, limited developer interest, and no clear advantages over Android or iOS. Meanwhile, Nokia's decision to abandon Symbian created immediate problems. Consumers stopped buying Nokia's existing phones because the company had essentially declared their current software platform dead. Developers abandoned Symbian entirely, knowing that Nokia was moving to Windows Phone. But Windows Phone devices wouldn't be ready for months, creating a gap where Nokia had nothing competitive to offer. During 2011, Nokia's smartphone sales collapsed by 73%, while Android manufacturers saw explosive growth. By 2012, the full scope of Nokia's strategic error was becoming clear. Android had become the dominant smartphone platform worldwide, with over 60% market share. Samsung, using Android, had become the largest smartphone manufacturer in the world. Even more painfully for Nokia, Samsung achieved this largely by doing what Nokia had always done best: creating devices for every market segment and price point, but using Google's free Android software instead of trying to develop their own platform. Nokia's Windows Phone devices, when they finally launched, were well built and received positive reviews for their hardware quality and innovative design. But they launched into a market where Android had over 700,000 applications available, while Windows Phone had fewer than 100,000. Consumers had no compelling reason to choose a Nokia Windows Phone over an Android device that could do everything the Nokia could do, plus run hundreds of thousands more applications. The numbers tell the story of Nokia's collapse with brutal clarity. In 2007, Nokia sold 437 million mobile phones and had revenues of over 51 billion euros. By 2012, their phone sales had dropped to 335 million units, despite the overall mobile market growing rapidly, and their revenues fell to 30 billion euros. Their smartphone market share, which had been over 50% in 2007, dropped to just 3% by 2013. The Windows Phone partnership, rather than saving Nokia, accelerated their decline. Windows Phone never gained significant market traction, peaking at just 3.2% of global smartphone sales. Meanwhile, Android grew from 0% market share in 2007 to over 80% by 2014, with Samsung alone selling more smartphones than Nokia's entire phone division. The final chapter of Nokia's mobile empire came in September 2013, when Microsoft announced they were acquiring Nokia's phone business for $7.2 billion. This wasn't a merger of equals or a strategic partnership. It was a fire sale. Microsoft was essentially buying Nokia's manufacturing capabilities and patent portfolio, but paying a fraction of what Nokia had been worth just a few years earlier. For context, Nokia's market capitalization at its peak had been over $200 billion. The sale price of $7.2 billion represented just the phone division, but it was still a stunning fall from grace. Microsoft continued making Nokia-branded phones for a few more years, but by 2017, they had effectively exited the mobile phone business entirely, selling their feature phone business to a Finnish company that licensed the Nokia brand. The Android platform's victory over Nokia wasn't just about one company beating another. It represented a fundamental shift in how technology industries would operate. Nokia's closed, proprietary approach had worked perfectly in the pre-smartphone era, when phones were primarily communication devices with limited functionality. But when smartphones became computing platforms capable of running thousands of different applications, the closed approach became a fatal liability. Android's open ecosystem allowed thousands of companies and millions of developers to contribute to the platform's success in ways that no single company, regardless of size or resources, could match. Today, Android runs on over 3 billion devices worldwide, powers everything from smartphones to smart TVs to automotive systems, and generates hundreds of billions in economic activity across the entire ecosystem. Nokia, meanwhile, remains a successful telecommunications infrastructure company, but their mobile phone empire, once the pride of Finland and the envy of the technology world, became a cautionary tale about the power of open platforms to destroy even the most dominant closed systems.